This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by NordVPN. When you use my link, you'll get a huge discount on a 2-year plan, plus 4 additional bonus months.
In the United States, we only have a small number of varieties of paper bills and denominations from 1 to 100, and the faces that adorn those bills are familiar, famous historical figures. While their portraits have changed a little bit since 1928, it's been the same faces that adorn the bills that are produced for general public use, the familiar Washington, Lincoln, Hamilton, Jackson, Grant, and Franklin. But over the course of its history, the United States has produced many kinds of federally printed paper money, and many faces have adorned those bills. For nearly a century, we produced silver certificates, which were paper denominations that were backed by and exchangeable for silver. And the faces on those bills were people that were important in their time, but many of them nearly forgotten today. It's history that deserves to be remembered.
Due in part to the spectacular failure of American Continentals during the American Revolution, the founders in general mistrusted paper money and left no provision for its printing. Occasionally, the government did print paper money, especially in times of crisis, such as the War of 1812 and the Panic of 1837, when they issued treasury notes, considered a loan to the government, which were paid back with interest. It wasn't until the calamity of the Civil War that the federal government moved to produce paper money in earnest. Financial strain led the government to issue demand notes, which were non-interest bearing. In February 1862, the first Legal Tender Act was passed, and new notes were authorized as legal tender, requiring them to be accepted at face value for most debts. These became known as greenbacks for the color of the ink used on their reverse. Though the government would attempt to limit the production of paper money, called U.S. notes, after the war, ultimately they would continue to be produced well into the 20th century. The Coinage Act of 1873 ended the American system of bimetallism by ceasing production of silver dollars, and by 1874 revised statutes meant that silver couldn't be used to pay debts exceeding $5. This surprised and infuriated silver producers in the West, who dubbed the bill the Crime of '73. Accusations of corruption were soon leveled at Congress in 1878. The Bland Allison Act was passed as a compromise to silver interests. While it wasn't truly a return to a bimetallic standard, it required the government to buy millions of dollars worth of silver every month to be minted into coins, and it authorized the production of silver certificates, paper money that could be redeemed for deposited silver. The Bland Allison Act did not specify how designs were to be chosen. Since 1863, Congress had mandated that bills be designed in the best manner to guard against counterfeiting, which generally meant intricate details. The act also authorized silver certificates in denominations from $10 to $1,000. This again was a compromise between free silver and gold standard advocates. Treasury Secretary John Sherman, under gold standard supporter President Rutherford B. Hayes, influenced the final wording and hoped to prevent silver from polluting the paper money supply, thus ensuring that the most common bills would remain U.S. notes. In his memoirs, Sherman argued that silver should remain only a subsidiary currency. The other consideration was that the act required the country to mint millions of dollars worth of silver coins, and Treasury officials and members of Congress feared that people would not want to carry heavy silver dollar coins. If low-denomination silver certificates were available, the coins would simply never leave the vaults. The Bureau had only become the sole printer of government currency in 1877, and the addition of silver certificates was a significant burden. The Bureau was then under some political attack for the cost of its activities, as its chief attempted to prove that printing in-house was more efficient than using private printers. The choices made for the initial 1878 series of certificates seems to have been influenced heavily by what the Bureau already had on hand. Robert Morris, who appeared on the $10 silver certificate, had first appeared likely with the same engraving on a $1,000 greenback issue. The other choices, Stephen Decatur for the $20 certificate, Edward Everett on the $50, James Monroe on the $100, Charles Sumner on the $500, and William Marcy on the $1,000 likely came from the Bureau's stock of dies. After its creation in 1862, the Bureau of Printing had begun having a collection of portraits and vignettes engraved of prominent figures, with examples published in U.S. Treasury specimen books, examples of which are scarce today. Although the choices may have been ones of convenience instead of work commissioned explicitly for the release, there was good reason to choose the portraits they did, though most of the names are somewhat obscure today. Robert Morris was by 1775 the richest man in America and served a prominent role in the Patriot cause. He is one of only two people, the other being Roger Sherman, subject of another episode of The History Guy, who signed the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution. He served as the Superintendent of Finance of the United States from 1781 to 1784. He has been called the financier of the Revolution. His work to supply the Continental Army, often using his own wealth and connections, was critical for the American victory at Yorktown in 1781. He declined Washington's offer to serve as the country's first Treasury Secretary, recommending instead his protege, Alexander Hamilton, meaning his thinking had a large impact on the initial financial system of the country. Despite his wealth, land speculation led to his financial ruin, and he spent several years in a debtor's prison at the end of his life before he died in 1806. Stephen Decatur, another name that now languishes in relative obscurity, was a sensational naval hero of the early Republic. Promoted at the age of 25, he is the youngest man ever promoted to the position of captain in the U.S. Navy. He was granted that promotion during the Tripolitan War against the Barbary pirates, when he led the daring operation to burn the USS Philadelphia while it sat captured in Tripoli Harbor. In a later battle with Tripolitan forces, his younger brother was injured when a Tripolitan ship treacherously feigned surrendering. When Stephen learned of the attack, he left the ship he had just captured with 10 other men, leading the charge onto the ship, though outnumbered 5-1. In a spectacular hand-to-hand fight, Decatur managed to kill the Barbary captain with a point-blank pistol shot. He commanded the famous USS Constitution for a time in many other ships, and during the War of 1812 captured HMS Macedonian, the first British warship ever to be brought into an American harbor as a prize. He led a 10-ship squadron in the Second Barbary War and successfully forced the Dey of Algeria to sue for peace. His own life was cut short in 1820 when he was killed in a duel with James Barron, subject of another episode of The History Guy. Edward Everett had died 13 years earlier in 1865 before he was selected to be printed on the $50 certificate. While essentially unknown today, he was renowned as one of the best orators of the period and was often called the Cicero of America. Everett was selected as the featured speaker for the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he spoke for over 2 hours directly before President Abraham Lincoln gave his famously brief Gettysburg Address. He famously wrote to Lincoln that I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes. In this period, Everett was a fondly remembered and famous American statesman. James Monroe, who was put on the $100 certificate, is probably the figure most familiar to a modern audience who appeared on the initial series. As 5th president of the country, he remains well remembered in the modern era for the Monroe Doctrine. He also served as Secretary of State under James Madison and Secretary of War under Jefferson, leading the department during the War of 1812. His presidency is heavily associated with the era of good feelings and a lack of partisan fighting in politics, and he signed the Adams-Otis Treaty, which purchased Florida from Spain. But maybe most importantly, he was perhaps the most aggressive pirate-fighting executive in U.S. history, sending the U.S. Navy all over the world to protect commerce, fight pirates, and dismantle their bases. He also had the transatlantic slave trade declared an act of piracy, punishable by death. Maybe it's more surprising that this is the only time that Monroe has appeared on American paper currency. When I say that all good stories involve pirates, I hope that everybody recognizes that that's just a story. In reality, all through history, running into a pirate was, terrible. James Monroe had it right. Fight pirates wherever you can. And today that means always, always, always use a VPN. You want your data behind a secure wall that protects your internet security from the cyber pirates and masks your IP address. And of course, you want the best VPN, NordVPN. I've been using NordVPN for years, and thank you NordVPN for sponsoring this video. I know that my data is safe with NordVPN, and it lets me keep my browsing to myself. And with thousands of servers around the world, you can get all the best streaming without being tied down to those annoying geographical limitations. Why choose NordVPN? 24/7 tech support, a strict no logs policy, a kill switch so your data is protected non-stop. Plus, one account allows you to connect up to 10 devices, including one-click next-generation encryption for mobile.
So be like James Monroe and fight pirates. History deserves to be remembered, but your internet history deserves to be your own. Use my link and you'll get a great deal on a 2-year plan, plus an additional 4 free bonus months. That's nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. It's the best deal that you will get on the internet. nordvpn.com/thehistoryguy, or use the link in the description below.
Charles Sumner appeared on the $500 certificate. While he is another obscure figure to a modern audience, he was well known in his time, a leading abolitionist who was nearly beaten to death on the floor of the Senate in 1856 by South Carolina Senator Preston Brooks. The attack was precipitated when Sumner insulted Preston's cousin, Senator Andrew Butler, by alluding to the idea that slavery was Butler's mistress, and implying Butler kept a slave as an actual mistress in a Senate speech. The vicious caning was lauded in the South, with the Richmond Enquirer writing that these vulgar abolitionists in the Senate must be lashed into submission. The event showed how deep the divide between North and South had gotten. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote afterwards that I do not see how a barbarous community and a civilized community can constitute one state. I think we must get rid of slavery, or we must get rid of freedom. Historian Stephen Palaio wrote that the caning was pushed inexorably and unstoppably to civil war. Members of Congress began arming themselves in the chambers. Brooks was given little punishment and not thrown out of the House. He resigned but was immediately re-elected. Sumner recovered and continued to agitate for abolition and rights for black Americans. He died in 1874, only a few years before the introduction of silver certificates. The final subject of the 1878 Silver Certificate series was William Learned Marcy. Essentially unknown to a modern audience, Marcy was a titanic figure in his time. He was a leading member of the Albany Regency, a group of Democrat politicians who controlled New York politics in the 1820s and 30s, and served as the Associate Justice of the New York Supreme Court, Senator and then Governor of New York, and then as Secretary of War under President James Polk and Secretary of State under Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. He was also a central figure in the negotiation of the Gadsden Purchase. In 1886, a new act was passed regarding silver certificates. Most importantly, the bill authorized $1, $2, and $5 certificates. The decision, according to a Bureau of Engraving and Printing History fact sheet, was in recognition of the fact that the public did not want to carry large numbers of the heavy silver dollar coins. An article in the Omaha Daily Bee reports that the quantity of actual coin dollars which the community would use reached an early and stubborn limit, but in the form of certificated much wider play was given to their use. The addition of 3 new denominations allowed the Treasury to add 3 new portraits. Most innovative was their inclusion on the $1 bill of Martha Washington. Based on a Gilbert Stuart portrait, is the first and only time that a real woman has appeared on American currency, as opposed to generic representations of liberty. Her inclusion was not especially controversial, although it was commented on. Suffragists sent letters of thanks into the Treasury, while one writer opined in the Kansas City Journal that suffragists shouldn't send thank yous, as Martha was a modest and sensible woman who would have blushed at the thought of going to the polls. Another joke that honest old George would be mad if he knew that we were running hhis wife's check on a 73-cent dollar, a comment on the relative value of silver to gold. For the $2 bill, a portrait of Winfield Scott Hancock was chosen. Hancock had died only months before the 1886 Act had been passed. Hancock had served in the Army for 40 years, through both the Mexican-American War and the Civil War for the North. Nicknamed Hancock the Superb by his soldiers, he served with distinction at the Battle of Gettysburg, commanding 4 corps on the left wing of the Army, a replacement after Major General John Reynolds was killed on July 1st. Hancock had the authority to withdraw, but chose to dig in at Gettysburg. He managed the hectic fighting as the Confederates assaulted the Union defenses. Though costly, his actions held Cemetery Ridge, and his troops bore the brunt of Pickett's famous charge. He was conspicuous during the battle, and when one of his troops told him that he was risking his life needlessly, Hancock famously replied, "There are times when a corps commander's life does not count." He was wounded in the fighting, shot in the thigh. He ran for president as a candidate for the Democrats in 1880, losing to James Garfield. The $5 certificate bore the portrait of President Ulysses S. Grant. Like Hancock, Grant had died recently in July of 1885. Despite his presidency's reputation for corruption, he was still well remembered generally, especially for his role during the Civil War. Finally, the 1886 series also replaced Robert Morris on the $10 bill with another recently deceased man, Thomas Hendricks, who had died in November of 1885 while he was serving as vice president under Grover Cleveland. Hendricks had served in both chambers of Congress and was a leader in Democratic opposition to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. He also served as governor of Indiana. Hendricks is unique in being the only vice president who never became president to ever be put on U.S. currency. He was also known for his general support of bimetallism and the use of silver as currency. The bill is known as the Tombstone Silver Certificate because of the shape of the border around his portrait. Stephen Decatur was replaced in the 1886 series $20 bill with Daniel Manning, yet another recently deceased figure. Manning served as Secretary of the Treasury under Cleveland until he resigned in March before his death in December 1887. Manning was a reporter, especially for the Albany Argus, an ally of reformers like New York Governor Samuel Tilden, and a banker. He gained prominence in Democratic circles in New York and as a leader in Cleveland's successful 1884 campaign for president. There were some minor changes for the 1891 series in designs, but only one additional portrait. Hancock was replaced on the $2 bill with William Wyndham. The approximate reasoning for his inclusion was likely his death in January of 1891, when he was still serving as Secretary of the Treasury. He served as a congressman from Minnesota and as a Treasury Secretary for less than a year under James Garfield, and then Chester Arthur, and later again under Benjamin Harrison. In Congress, he was known for his efforts to regulate the railroad, and as a chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Transportation Routes to the Seaboard, he produced a report which recommended a Bureau of Commerce, substantially similar to the Interstate Commerce Commission that was eventually created 13 years later. In the 1880s, the certificates would see another design change, and one that became one of the most controversial and well-remembered bills in numismatic collection. As early as 1894, the Cedar Rapids Gazette reported on the new designs for the bill, writing that the design was painted by Walter Sherlow. The series of 3 bills, today known as the Educational Series, are some of the most detailed and artistic bills ever released as U.S. currency. All 3 were designed by artists and muralists and were allegorical representations of advancing technology and industry. The $1 bill, titled History Instructing Youth, has the allegorical woman History pointing towards the Washington, D.C. skyline. It also included the wreath names of 23 prominent Americans like Lincoln, Henry Clay, Jefferson, Washington, Samuel B. Morse, and Admiral David Farragut. On its reverse are portraits of both Martha and George Washington. The $2 bill represents science, presenting steam and electricity to commerce and manufacture. On its reverse are 2 inventors, Samuel Morse, namesake of Morse code, and Robert Fulton, credited with developing the world's first successful steamboat. The $5 bill, entitled Electricity as the Dominant Force in the World, would be the most controversial. The central figures, one winged and holding a light bulb aloft, are scantily clothed, with exposed breasts. On the reverse of the portraits of Grant and General Philip Sheridan. The New York Times called the $5 bill one of the finest allegorical designs in the world, but some protested the nudity. Anthony Comstock, a religious fundamentalist known to history for his namesake Comstock Act, which outlawed sending objectionable material in the mail, hated the bills. Smithsonian Magazine quotes collector Gene Hessler, writing that Comstock demanded the recall of these dirty dollars. The Guidebook of United States Paper Money says the several Boston society ladies rallied against the design and some banks resisted taking them. The origin of the term, banned in Boston. Just as important, bank tellers disliked the bills. The Times quoted one cashier who said the new certificates are an absolute nuisance when they get soiled, leading to bothersome eye strain. Redesigns were made to address these issues, and several other designs were proposed, including an agriculture and forestry $10 bill and mention of a $20 Mayflower note. But in 1897, with the election of William McKinley and the appointment of Treasury Secretary Lyman Gage, the experiment was quickly put to bed. Gage valued simplicity, saying that no fresco painters would be brought in for designs. Under Gage, yet new designs were printed in 1899. The $1 bill now bore an eagle, while the $2 bill had a smaller Washington portrait flanked by 2 figures. Because of the small portrait, it is often called the mini porthole bill. The only other design change was on the $5 bill, which saw another unique printing. While the reasoning is uncertain, the 1899 $5 certificate bears the image of a Lakota chief called Running Antelope in English. His appearance was not seen as controversial, although it remains the only time that a Native American has been featured as the central motif on American printed currency. Of course, there was a long tradition of using Native American images on American coins. Running Antelope was a high-ranking member of the Hunkpapa Lakota and advocated compromise with whites. The image on the bill was based on a photograph taken in 1872 when Running Antelope went to Washington, D.C. to meet President Grant. He died in 1896 or 1897. The New York Times incorrectly identified the portrait as one of Red Jacket in a June 26, 1900 issue. There's an important difference between the photograph used as a model and the final image on the bill, the headdress. Apparently the headdress in the photograph was too tall to fit on the bill, but instead of finding another image, the headdress was simply redesigned. While there is some disagreement, the headdress Running Antelope wears on the bill is certainly not of Lakota origin. Some have identified it as a Pawnee headdress, a particularly poor choice given the historical antagonism between the Lakota and Pawnee tribes. The final major change to silver certificates came in 1923 when Washington replaced the eagle on the $1 and Lincoln replaced Running Antelope. All of the bills were resized in 1928 to the current small notes, and portraits were standardized across silver certificates, gold certificates, U.S. notes, and Federal Reserve notes. The 1929 series saw Hendricks replaced with Alexander Hamilton.
Silver certificates were produced into the 1960s before they were finally retired. They represent a long period of American history, and the faces that adorn each of them tell us what was important to us at that point in history. The educational bills even represent a whole different concept of what we at one time thought our money should look like. They also represent an interesting time in financial history, born of the conflict between gold interest and silver interest at a time when our currency was still backed directly by precious metals, and when people were disagreeing over whether we even should produce paper money at all. Today, silver certificates are regarded as a curiosity. They are widely collected, each one telling a story that is more than their face value. The hobby of studying and collecting paper currency and banknotes is called notophily. And as we use paper currency less and less, it might not be very long before the familiar Washington, Lincoln, Hamilton, Jackson, Grant, and Franklin themselves become history, merely reminders of our notophilic past. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.